A racist police officer bullies a black father in front of his children. Unaware the man is a federal judge. What happens next will leave you speechless. It was a bright Saturday morning when Terrence Miller, a tall, composed black man in his late 40s, took his two sons, Malik and Jordan, out for breakfast after their weekly library visit. The sun shone brightly, casting long shadows on the pavement. As the family walked side by side, their footsteps in sync. Malik, 11, and Jordan, 8, adored these mornings, not just for the pancakes but for the peaceful time spent together. These weekends had become something of a ritual, a time for bonding and quiet moments after the bustle of the workweek. Terrence's easygoing demeanor made these moments even more special. He was dressed simply in a casual button-down shirt and slacks, yet he exuded a quiet strength, his presence calm and unassuming but always respected by those who knew him. As the family made their way toward their car, parked near the curb in the busy parking lot of a suburban diner, the world felt peaceful. The sounds of traffic on the street, the laughter of children playing in a nearby park, and the hum of conversation inside the diner all blended into a warm backdrop to their simple outing. Malik and Jordan were talking about the books they'd checked out at the library, arguing good-naturedly over which one would be read first. Terrence chuckled at their banter, letting their voices fill the air, a clear contrast to the tense silence that was about to envelop them. Without warning, a police cruiser screeched to a halt just behind them. The sharp, unsettling sound of tires grinding against asphalt pierced the air, causing Malik and Jordan to jump in surprise. Terrence, already familiar with the harsh sounds of life's unpredictability, kept his pace slow and steady. His gaze shifted toward the vehicle, but his expression remained neutral. He had learned long ago that maintaining composure in moments like this was a matter of survival. The car's door swung open with a thud, and Officer Ryan Hale, a white cop in his early 30s with a reputation for aggressive stops, stepped out. His boots hit the pavement with a sense of authority, his stance wide, as though he was preparing for a confrontation. He was tall, muscular, with a square jaw and eyes that seemed to always be scanning, searching for someone or something to challenge. His uniform was crisp, but there was an air of hostility in the way he carried himself, a subtle tension in his movements that sent a ripple through the otherwise calm morning. "You fit the description," Hale barked, his voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the normality of the moment like a knife. His eyes scanned Terrence up and down, his gaze lingering a little too long, as if sizing him up. His hand hovered over his radio, fingers twitching, ready to make contact with the rest of the officers. But Terrence didn't react the way Hale expected. Terrence raised his eyebrows calmly, his body language the picture of unruffled composure. "What charge am I being detained for?" he asked, his voice steady, almost like he was inquiring about the weather. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his tone, didn't even move his hands from his pockets. He wasn't resisting. He was simply asking, as any person would when faced with such an abrupt and unfounded accusation. Hale's eyes flickered, his expression hardening. "I said you fit the description," he repeated, his tone growing more insistent, more forceful. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The words hung in the air, thick with tension, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow. Malik and Jordan froze, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. They hadn't seen their father in a situation like this, and the unfamiliarity of it made the weight of the moment feel unbearable. Malik's hand gripped his phone tightly, his knuckles white, unsure whether to record what was happening or if doing so would make things worse. Jordan, unable to fully understand the gravity of the situation, instinctively grabbed onto his father's leg, his small fingers curling into the fabric of Terrence's slacks. His eyes darted nervously between the officer and his father, unable to process why someone would treat their dad like this. Terrence didn't move. He remained calm, still, his hands now at his sides, his posture relaxed but not submissive. His eyes locked onto Hale's, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. He wasn't afraid, not yet, but he was aware of what could come next. His sons didn't understand, not yet, but he would make sure they would, He would make sure they would see that this wasn't their fault, that they were not the ones who had done anything wrong. Before Hale could say another word, he stepped forward, his hands quick and aggressive. He grabbed Terrence's arm roughly, twisting it behind his back in a move that spoke more to his need for control than to any sense of lawful authority. "You're under arrest," Hale muttered, his voice edged with disdain. He pushed Terrence against the car, the metal of the vehicle cold against his chest, as the officer fumbled with his cuffs. The sound of the handcuffs clicking into place echoed through the parking lot, sharp and final. Malik's scream cut through the air, raw with panic and fear. "He didn't do anything," he shouted, his voice cracking. He held his phone up, the camera shaking with his unsteady hand. "What are you doing to him?" Jordan, his face flushed with fear, buried his face in his father's side, unable to comprehend the scene unfolding before him. He had always seen his father as someone untouchable, a figure of unwavering strength. But in this moment, Terrence was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, vulnerable, helpless in the eyes of the law. He had no idea what was happening, but instinctively, he knew it wasn't right. It wasn't fair. Bystanders, standing around the diner, began to take notice, but none of them moved. A few shuffled their feet awkwardly, glancing over their shoulders, as if too afraid to intervene, to speak up. The unspoken agreement in the air was clear. Don't get involved. Just watch. It was a common reaction, one that Terrence had grown used to over the years, people who would see injustice and choose to remain silent. The officer, Hale, now had his hands firmly on Terrence, pushing him further into the car. He was gritting his teeth, his voice louder now, almost as if he were trying to convince himself as much as the people around him. "You don't get to question me. I've got a job to do." But Terrence didn't argue. He stayed quiet, his face a mask of calm. His breath was steady, his heartbeat just a little faster, but nothing in his posture betrayed fear. He'd faced worse in his life, and this was just another test. He only needed to make it through this moment. He only needed to hold his ground until the truth was exposed. The world around them felt like it had suddenly become smaller. The noise of the diner, the sounds of life continuing around them, seemed distant now, muffled by the thudding of his own heart. He had to stay calm. He had to show Malik and Jordan that no matter what happened, their father was stronger than any injustice that could come his way. As Hale continued his aggressive questioning, Terrence's mind raced through his options. The situation was escalating quickly, but he couldn't let it break him. He couldn't let it break his sons. He knew the system was flawed. He had spent his life working within it, fighting for fairness in a system that often wasn't fair to people like him. He had earned his place, and this was a stark reminder that no matter how far he'd come, no matter how many titles he had accumulated, to some people, he would always just be another black man to be feared. And right now, as the handcuffs bit into his wrists, as Malik's voice trembled in the background, that fear was rising in his chest. But Terrence Miller was not a man who let fear control him. He wasn't going to let this moment define him or his sons. Not today. "Keep your hands to yourself," Hale growled, but his voice wavered ever so slightly. Terrence looked at him, his expression still calm, but a flicker of something deeper passed across his eyes. The officer was about to learn something he had never expected. Something no one ever expected. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. It was an ordinary morning, the kind of morning where everything should have felt like a gentle breeze, simple, serene. But it wasn't. Not anymore. The air was thick now, charged with the tension of something more than just a routine encounter. Officer Ryan Hale's hands were rough, his actions quick and purposeful as he rifled through Terrence Miller's pockets, his fingers brushing against the smooth leather of a wallet. The harshness of his grip mirrored his impatience, as if everything about this situation was beneath him. Terrence stood perfectly still, unmoved by the officer's aggression. His face remained an impassive mask, the only sign of his inner calm being the way his eyes barely flicked toward his sons, Malik and Jordan, standing a few feet away, watching in horror. Hale's eyes scanned the wallet's contents. The name Terrence Miller caught his attention, but only for a second. A half-hearted mutter escaped his lips. Terrence Miller, huh? He tossed the wallet onto the hood of the car as if it were an afterthought. To him, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except asserting control. He didn't need to know who this man was. He was just another black man, another suspect in a long line of confrontations. And this one was going to be just like the others. Boy, you better understand something. You're lucky I don't teach you respect the hard way. Hale sneered, his voice dripping with venom. He stood taller, looming over Terrence, trying to dwarf him with sheer presence. His body was stiff, as if waiting for some kind of response, some kind of fight. But Terrence didn't give him that satisfaction. His lips barely parted, the faintest twitch of his mouth the only sign he heard the insult. Jordan's eyes were wide with confusion and fear. The tears were already welling up, but he was too afraid to move or speak. Malik, on the other hand, was quick to react. His hand shook as he held up the phone, recording the scene, his fingers trembling so much that the video was a blur, catching only fragments of the injustice unfolding. The low hum of the crowd's murmurs filled the air, people standing frozen in place, as if unsure whether to intervene or simply watch. Terrence's voice cut through the chaos, as calm as ever, yet carrying an unspoken weight. Sir, I recommend you look at that ID again. His voice was steady, a quiet but insistent command. It was the kind of voice that had commanded respect in courtrooms and boardrooms. It wasn't a challenge, but a simple request, a suggestion that Hale might want to reconsider his judgment before things escalated further. Hale's lips curled into a smirk, his eyes narrowing with amusement. He dismissed Terrence's calm voice as nothing more than a weak attempt at posturing. You think I don't know how this works? Nice try, but you don't scare me, he scoffed, the disdain dripping from his words. He turned away, waving his hand dismissively, convinced that he had already won this interaction. The tension in the air thickened with every passing second. Malik's shaky voice broke the silence. Dad, what's going on? His words were soft, barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of confusion and fear. He knew his father, knew the man who could speak calmly to anyone, the man who had always taught him to stay composed in the face of adversity. But this wasn't right. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. His father, his strong, intelligent father, was being treated like a criminal. His eyes flicked to Jordan, whose sobs were growing more frantic. Malik's hand tightened around the phone, the video a shaky testament to the violence unfolding before him. Don't worry, Malik. It's okay, Terrence said, his words directed at his son, though his gaze never left Hale. He didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He just stood there, silently enduring the weight of the officer's ignorance, the injustice of the situation bearing down on him. It wasn't until Officer Simmons arrived that the scene shifted slightly. He was older, more reserved, a man who had seen his fair share of encounters, but who seemed less eager to escalate the situation. Simmons looked around the scene, his eyes scanning the tense crowd, before finally resting on the wallet still lying on the hood of the car. His gaze shifted, catching the gleaming federal badge tucked inside. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the faintest wrinkle of recognition passing over his features. He leaned in, whispering something to Hale, but Hale, too proud to acknowledge his mistake, brushed him off. It's fine, Simmons, Hale muttered, his voice filled with irritation. He didn't need help. Not from Simmons, not from anyone. He was the officer here. He was in control. You're overthinking it. But Simmons wasn't so sure. He took a step back, unsure of how to proceed. He didn't feel the same certainty that Hale did. Something wasn't right here. But what could he do? His hands were tied. The camera phones around them were growing more intrusive, the faces of the bystanders filled with anticipation. They were waiting for something to happen, for someone to step in and stop this before it went too far. The air was suffocating now, thick with the tension of a moment that was teetering on the edge of something much bigger. And still, Terrence remained perfectly still, the calm in the eye of the storm. His sons were beside him, their faces painted with fear, but he didn't look at them. He didn't need to. He had already prepared them for moments like this. Not in the way a father might prepare his sons for school or for sports, but in the way of understanding their own worth, their place in a world that would sometimes seek to diminish them. He had taught them that power wasn't just about what you could do to others. It was about what you could endure. And in that moment, it wasn't just Terrence's strength that was being tested. It was the very integrity of the system that had allowed this to happen in the first place, the system that had turned an innocent father into a suspect in the eyes of an officer too blinded by his own biases to see the truth. The crowd was waiting. The phones were waiting. Simmons was waiting. Hale, however, was the only one who hadn't yet realized that the weight of his actions would soon crash down on him. The morning sun was just beginning to rise, casting long, golden rays across the suburban diner's parking lot. It was a quiet Saturday, the usual hum of everyday life undisturbed, until the screech of tires shattered the peace. Officer Ryan Hale's police cruiser came to a halt, the sound of its tires biting into the asphalt louder than any of the morning's birdsong. His face was set, as always, tight, focused, and just a little too sure of himself. Terrence Miller didn't react to the officer's sudden arrival. He simply continued walking toward his car, the steady rhythm of his footsteps in sync with the quiet morning. His sons, Malik and Jordan, flanked him, their hands swinging at their sides. Malik's eager chatter was interrupted by a sudden, forceful hand on Terrence's shoulder. "Hey, what are you doing?" Officer Hale's voice was gruff, with an edge to it. Terrence turned slowly, his brow furrowing slightly as he looked up at the officer. "I'm heading to my car," he replied calmly, maintaining eye contact, not letting his posture or voice betray any tension. The officer's gaze sharpened, inspecting Terrence's every feature. "You fit the description," Hale said, his words coming out clipped, like he was reciting something he had rehearsed. But there was no context, no charge, no explanation. Just an accusation hanging in the air like an unwanted cloud. Terrence's voice remained even as he asked, "What description?" Hale didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked toward Terrence's sons, who had stopped walking and now stood frozen by his side, wide-eyed and confused. "Get against the car," Hale barked, his voice rising, making the surrounding air feel heavy. He shoved Terrence's chest with force, almost as if to make a point. Terrence didn't flinch. He simply obeyed, pressing his back against the car with slow deliberation, still maintaining that calm facade. "Hey, stop it," Malik yelled, his voice trembling but rising in desperation. Jordan's small hands went to his face, trying to stifle the tears that had already begun to fall. "Dad, what's going on?" Jordan cried out, his innocent question laced with confusion and fear. Terrence turned his head slowly, looking down at his sons, his face softening for a brief moment before he locked eyes with Malik. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to reassure them. "It's okay, boys," he murmured, voice low, steady. "Stay calm. It's going to be okay." Hale's grip on Terrence's arm tightened as he reached into the older man's pockets. The search rough, unnecessary, a clear show of dominance. His fingers fumbled, impatient, as if he expected to find something that confirmed his assumptions. He muttered under his breath, pulling out a wallet and flipping it open with an air of disinterest. Terrence didn't resist, offering no sign of struggle or even surprise. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, his face unreadable. The officer scanned the ID for only a brief second, not even bothering to truly look at the name. "Terrence Miller, huh?" Hale muttered, tossing the wallet back onto the hood of the car, not even waiting for an answer. His tone was dismissive, the kind of underestimation that so often accompanies those who believe they hold all the power. But it was at that moment, in the silence that followed, that the words escaped Gerald's lips. The retired lawyer had been inside the diner, enjoying his own quiet breakfast, when the scene outside caught his attention. The frantic movement of the officers, the subdued cries of the children, it made something inside him shift. As he stepped outside to see what was happening, his eyes immediately locked onto the figure by the car. Terrence Miller. The name, at first, didn't register. But then, it hit him like a punch to the gut. Judge Miller. Gerald's hand instinctively went to his chest, where his breath caught for a moment. It wasn't just any man being treated this way. It was a federal judge. A respected figure in the legal community. Someone who had stood for justice on countless occasions. And here he was manhandled, disrespected, in front of his own children. It was unthinkable. The realization sent a sharp jolt through him, and without a second thought, he made his way toward the officers. "Hey!" Gerald's voice cut through the tense silence, a mix of urgency and disbelief. "You need to check that man's identity before you destroy your career." Officer Hale's reaction was one of annoyance, a knee-jerk response to anyone daring to question his authority. He rolled his eyes, sneering at Gerald. "What's this now? Who the hell are you?" Gerald didn't back down. His face was a mask of frustration, his body tense with restrained anger. "That man you've got cuffed? He's a federal judge. Appointed 6 years ago. Look again." For a moment, Hale just stared at him, clearly not expecting this. His eyes flickered toward the crowd now forming, murmurs spreading like wildfire. The doubt crept in, slowly but unmistakably. He could feel it. This was no longer just about him exercising his power. This was a whole different ball game. But his pride didn't let him admit it. Not yet. Gerald stepped closer, his voice growing louder, filled with authority. "Judge Terrence Miller, if you don't check that ID now, you will ruin your life and your career." Hale's hands faltered, his smugness beginning to slip. He walked over to the wallet, stooping to pick it up again. This time he paused, inspecting the badge tucked inside. His fingers hovered over the golden seal, the polished metal glinting under the sunlight. The letters, Federal, stared back at him. He blinked, and again, a second time, disbelief settling in. Simmons, the other officer who had been silent until now, took a step closer. His eyes widened ever so slightly, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He had been quiet, watching, waiting to see how Hale would handle this. Now it was clear. Hale had crossed a line. Simmons leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "You should check with Internal Affairs. Now." Hale didn't respond. He was still staring at the badge, his face now a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. The weight of his mistake was beginning to crash over him, but he couldn't bring himself to admit it. Not yet. His pride, his stubbornness, it wouldn't let him. Around them, the atmosphere felt thick, as if the whole world had paused. The people standing nearby had all turned their cameras toward the scene. Every movement, every action was being recorded. The boys' sobs rang out like an uncomfortable reminder that this wasn't just about one man's mistake. It was about the damage being done to their family, to their dignity, in front of the entire world. The tension in the air grew unbearable, the quiet hum of the parking lot now replaced by the weight of anticipation. Gerald stood firm, his eyes locked on Hale, a silent challenge in the air. He was waiting for an apology, waiting for Hale to do the right thing. But he knew deep down that the damage had already been done. Hale's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking between Terrence and the badge in his hand. The reality of what he had just done, what he was about to be held accountable for, was beginning to hit him. And as the camera flashes went off around them, the crowd closed in. It wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was a moment of reckoning. But it wasn't over. Not yet. And it wasn't going to end quietly. By the time Terrence Miller stepped into his office the next morning, the weight of the previous day's events had settled deep into his bones. The silence that surrounded him felt thick, like the calm before a storm. He hadn't slept much. He had barely managed to eat. All he could think about was the video Malik had captured. Every replay, every comment, every passing glance from a colleague or stranger reminded him that the world had just seen a small fraction of what he had endured. The video was everywhere, on social media, news outlets, even morning talk shows. A firestorm had erupted, but instead of the usual rush of reporters knocking on his door, seeking an interview, there was a stark, deliberate silence. It was the kind of silence he could feel pressing against his chest. His phone buzzed, breaking his trance. It was a message from his assistant, Stacy. The chief of police would like to speak with you. Personally apologize for the incident yesterday. Please let me know if you would like me to arrange a meeting. Terrence stared at the screen for a long time, his thoughts swirling. Personal apology. That was all they had to offer. An apology. He could already feel his blood beginning to boil at the thought. The truth was, an apology wasn't what he wanted. Apologies could not erase what had happened, could not change the fact that his sons had witnessed an officer's brutal display of power, could not undo the years of systemic racism that had made it so easy for Officer Hale to treat him as less than. With a sigh, Terrence set the phone down and pressed his palms to his eyes. He didn't want to do this anymore. He didn't want to be part of this fight. But he had no choice. His sons had seen it. They had heard it. They had felt it. A knock at the door pulled him out of his thoughts. "Come in," he called. Stacy walked in with a folder in her hands. She didn't say anything at first, but the look on her face told Terrence all he needed to know. "It's official," she said quietly, setting the folder down on his desk. "Internal Affairs has opened an investigation." Terrence glanced at the folder. He felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over him, but it was quickly overshadowed by the cold weight of what was still to come. It wasn't over yet. The storm was just beginning. "I need to speak to the oversight officers," Terrence said firmly, rising to his feet. He could feel the urge to act, to control what was happening. Make it happen. Now. Stacy nodded and left the room, leaving Terrence alone again. He walked to the window and looked out over the city. The sky was a dull gray, the kind of morning that felt both heavy and foreboding. Somewhere out there, Hale was still on the other side of a desk, scrambling to defend himself, trying to explain away what he had done. But Terrence knew the truth. Hale was already backing into a corner. His silence the day before had said everything. And the video, that had sealed his fate. Minutes later, Stacy returned with a phone call from the federal oversight officers. "Terrence, we're ready to move forward with the charges," she said, her voice steady. "They've got Hale's body cam footage as well as the social media videos. And we've got a few good witnesses who were there." Terrence's grip on the phone tightened. "I want to make sure this isn't swept under the rug," he said, his voice firm. "This isn't just about me. This is about accountability. This is about breaking the cycle." Stacy nodded, but Terrence could see the concern in her eyes. He knew she understood what was at stake. What Hale had done wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern, a deeply ingrained behavior that had been allowed to fester for far too long. And now it was his responsibility to tear it down. The next few days were a blur. Terrence barely slept, spending hours in meetings with federal agents, poring over documents, and crafting a case that would leave no room for doubt. Each phone call, each meeting, brought him closer to something larger than just personal justice. It was about something bigger than him, the power dynamics, the abuse of authority, the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. He was about to make sure it would never happen again. The media didn't help. They kept asking questions, kept pushing for sound bites. But Terrence wasn't interested in the spotlight. He refused all interview requests. "I'm not here for attention," he would say to any reporter who called. "I'm here for accountability." And then, there it was, the moment when everything began to change. Terrence sat at his desk, sifting through a stack of papers, when his phone rang again. This time it was from the chief of police. Terrence hesitated for a moment before answering. "Judge Miller." The chief's voice sounded strained. "I just wanted to reach out to personally apologize for what happened yesterday. This should have never occurred." Terrence exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. The words were exactly what he expected, but they still sent a spark of anger through him. "I appreciate you calling," Terrence replied, his voice controlled but unwavering. "But this isn't about an apology. This is about a pattern. A system that has allowed this to happen time and time again." There was silence on the other end for a moment. "What do you mean by pattern?" the chief asked, his voice cautious now. Terrence stood up, walking around his office as he spoke. "Hale's actions are part of a much larger problem, he said, his voice firm. "And I'm going to break it. You can apologize all you want, but that won't fix what's broken. You have a problem in your department, and it's going to be dealt with. I'm not going to let this slide." The chief hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Well, we've already started a full review of the department," he offered, his voice now more defensive. "We're taking this very seriously, Judge Miller." Terrence didn't buy it. "I'll believe it when I see it," he said, his voice colder than before. "But don't think for a second that this is just going to go away because you've sent a few officers home. You've got a systemic issue, and it's time for some real change." He hung up before the chief could say anything else. The days that followed brought more tense meetings and phone calls. Hale's suspension became official. Simmons, the officer who had tried to warn Hale, submitted a written statement confirming Terrence's identity and admitting Hale had ignored his warnings. Terrence's case was beginning to take shape, and the media storm was only getting worse for the police department. Through it all, Terrence kept his calm, but his mind raced with thoughts of what would come next. This was just the beginning of a larger fight, a fight for justice, for accountability, and for the protection of all citizens from the abuses of those who were sworn to protect them. On the final day before the case would officially go before the courts, Terrence walked into the diner again, this time without the weight of handcuffs on his wrists. The atmosphere was different now. The diner was quieter, more respectful. As he entered, a few patrons nodded their heads in acknowledgement. Gerald, the retired lawyer who had been the first to recognize him, walked over and offered a hug. "You're not just fighting for yourself," Gerald said softly. "You're fighting for all of us." Terrence nodded, his voice steady. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." And as he sat there with his sons, explaining to them what true justice meant, not revenge, but correction, he felt something shift within himself. He wasn't just breaking a pattern. He was starting a new chapter, one where the truth would carry more weight than the lies that had been built over so many years. Terrence stood still, his posture unwavering. The rough metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, their cold, metallic grip a harsh reminder of the moment's brutality. His heart pounded in his chest, not with fear, but with a searing calm, one that held the storm at bay. In his peripheral vision, he could see Malik's face twisted in terror, his eyes wide and filled with confusion. Jordan, trembling next to him, gripped his brother's arm tightly, as if trying to hold onto some semblance of safety. The air around them was thick, pressing in on the scene like an oppressive weight. People watched, but none of them dared speak up. Not yet. Officer Hale stood just a few paces away, the tension in his face palpable. His hands were still clenched at his sides, the smug arrogance from earlier starting to erode beneath the weight of his realization. His breath, shallow and quick, spoke volumes. But he didn't speak. Not yet. The crowd had grown, and phones were being raised like silent witnesses to his wrongdoing. Terrence's gaze didn't leave Hale for a moment, but his mind was miles away. The truth of the situation, of how his children were watching him in this moment, gnawed at his soul, yet he held it in check, focusing on the immediate threat, the officer who had dared to degrade him. His mind shifted between the past and present in a disorienting rush of thoughts. The years of hard work, the cases, the sacrifices, all for nothing in a world where a man could be reduced to a criminal by a simple decision. He gritted his teeth, but his body didn't betray him. He was in control. He had to be. Hale's eyes narrowed, but he didn't challenge Terrence's composure. Instead, he hesitated, shifting his weight, clearly unsure of what to do next. The silence between them felt suffocating. It wasn't just the cold that gripped the air. It was the knowing. The knowing that this was more than an encounter. It was a reckoning. "Uncuff me. Now," Terrence said, his voice low but powerful, carrying an edge that demanded compliance. Hale's hands trembled slightly, just enough for Terrence to notice. The tension between them shifted. The officer hesitated, the authority he had wielded moments before slipping like water through his fingers. His jaw clenched, but he moved forward. Slowly, he reached for the cuffs, and with a sharp click, they were undone. The air felt different now, lighter, less oppressive, though still thick with the remnants of what had transpired. Terence flexed his wrists once, his muscles sore from the strain, but his demeanor remained as calm as ever. He took a step back, then turned to his sons, his expression softening for just a moment. He saw the fear in their eyes, the confusion. He knew the image they had just witnessed would be burned into their memories forever, no matter how this played out. His voice, quiet and firm, cut through the tension. "It's okay now," he said. His words more of a reassurance to them than a statement to anyone else. Then, with a turn back to Officer Hale, his voice grew colder, like steel forged in fire. "You're going to remember this moment for the rest of your life." Hale's mouth opened, but no words came out. His usual bravado had vanished, leaving behind a man caught in the web of his own arrogance. He tried to speak, maybe to apologize, maybe to explain, but nothing coherent formed on his tongue. He stumbled over his words, trying to reassert control, but it was clear that the moment had shifted irrevocably. Terence's gaze hardened. He wasn't done yet. He raised a hand, not to strike, but to silence Hale's fumbling apology. "You thought I was less. You thought you could humiliate me in front of my sons. You don't even know the cost of what you've just done," he said, his voice like a sharp whisper cutting through the thickening silence. For a long moment, Hale said nothing. His face flushed, his eyes darting between the crowd and Terence. His confidence had evaporated. His power over the situation had crumbled like dust in the wind. Simmons, the older officer who had stood by in silence, shuffled awkwardly to the side, his eyes avoiding contact with Terence. He had seen something in Hale's eyes, a crack in the veneer of invulnerability. Simmons' discomfort was palpable, and it seemed as though he too was realizing just how much had gone wrong. Terence didn't even look at Simmons. His focus remained entirely on Hale. He knew what had to happen next. This wasn't just about an apology. This wasn't just about clearing his name in front of his sons. This was about the bigger picture, the systemic abuse of power, the cycle of oppression that could only be dismantled if those responsible were held accountable. And it was going to start right here, right now. With one slow, deliberate motion, Terence pulled out his phone from the pocket of his jacket. His fingers were steady as he navigated through the screen, but his heart raced with a sense of cold certainty. The next steps had been planned for years, even if he hadn't expected them to unfold this way. His life had been dedicated to justice, but now the scales were tipped, and he was going to make them balance again. He tapped the screen, the sound of the keys clicking louder than it should have been in the heavy silence of the moment. He lifted the phone to his ear, never breaking eye contact with Officer Hale. "Yes, it's Judge Miller. I'd like to file an official misconduct complaint and request immediate body cam retrieval from Officer Hale and Simmons." "Yes, right now." The words were clear, deliberate, and without hesitation. The air shifted again, this time with the weight of real consequence. Hale's face paled as he stood there, caught in the crosshairs of his own actions. His shoulders slumped in defeat. He had no power here. Not anymore. Terence hung up, the sound of the call's end echoing through the otherwise quiet lot. The stillness seemed to stretch on for an eternity. The silence was filled with 1,000 unspoken thoughts, yet all that needed to be said had already been laid out. He turned to his sons, who had been watching every moment, every word. Malik's hand was still tightly clutching Jordan's, but now there was something different in their eyes, something that Terence had worked his entire life to teach them. Strength. The quiet, unwavering strength that came not from shouting or fighting, but from knowing what was right and standing by it, no matter the cost. Terence reached out to them, his hands enveloping theirs as they stood together, united in this moment. He wasn't just teaching them about justice. He was showing them the power of their own voices. He was showing them that it was possible to speak truth to power without raising a fist. But as they walked away, their steps slow and deliberate, Terence knew that the storm had only just begun. This was just the first ripple. The real battle lay ahead, and he was ready for it. Officer Hale sat alone in the cramped, sterile meeting room, the fluorescent lights above flickering ever so slightly as if even the building itself couldn't bear to be associated with him. He stared at the table before him, at the pile of documents he had been handed when he was called into this room. The papers were scattered in front of him, the edges curling up like the crumbling remnants of a broken trust. His hands rested motionless, his fingers twitching slightly as if they wanted to pick up the documents, but something held him back. A sense of detachment, or perhaps the suffocating weight of regret, kept him frozen in place. He had been a cop for almost 10 years, but never had he felt so utterly out of his depth. Sitting across from him, his union representative, a middle-aged man with a crisp suit that looked entirely out of place in this atmosphere, kept glancing at Hale with nervous energy. His tie seemed just a little too tight, and his shoulders were hunched, as if trying to shrink into the fabric of the chair. The union rep's eyes darted around the room, perhaps looking for something to grasp, a solution, a way out. But he knew, deep down, there was no escaping this. The door creaked open and in stepped Captain Daniels. His expression was as hard as the stone walls that lined the precinct, but there was a subtle shift in his posture when he saw Hale. It was as though he wanted to look away but couldn't quite bring himself to do it. Hale's heart sank, the brief, fleeting hope that perhaps someone would stand up for him evaporating in an instant. Daniels didn't speak immediately. He just stood there, a grim figure looming in the doorway. It was as if the very presence of the captain added to the pressure in the room. Hale shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His eyes flicked nervously toward the table, toward the documents, the damning evidence of his actions, but he couldn't bring himself to look at them for long. It felt like staring into a mirror that reflected a man he no longer recognized. "You've been a cop for a long time, Hale," Daniels finally spoke, his voice low and even, yet carrying the weight of authority. "And yet, you managed to screw this up so badly that now every news outlet in the country is running your name through the mud." Hale's throat tightened. He had expected the reprimand, but hearing it felt like a slap across the face. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He was too ashamed, too hollowed out by the reality of what he had done. How had it gone so wrong? He had been sure of himself, sure that his actions were justified. But this wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger. Daniels took a step closer, his boots scraping softly against the floor. "It's not just the profiling of a federal judge that's the issue, Hale. It's the fact that you've done this before, and there are no consequences until someone with power gets involved. The media's calling for your head, the public is demanding change, and frankly, I'm surprised you're still sitting here thinking there's a way out." The union rep cleared his throat, looking between the two men, and in that moment, he seemed more like a bystander than a representative. He could feel the walls closing in, but he remained silent, knowing that any words now would only make things worse. Hale's hands clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles whitening as he fought to regain control over his emotions. I didn't know who he was, and that's the problem, Hale," Daniels interrupted, his voice turning colder. "You didn't care enough to know. You saw a black man and assumed you could get away with treating him however you wanted. That's what we're dealing with here, and that's why you're sitting here." The weight of Daniels' words settled over him like a heavy blanket. Hale's mind raced, memories of the incident flooding his thoughts. The look on Judge Miller's face, the calmness that unnerved him, the sound of his son crying out in fear. He had never seen it that way until now. Now all the pieces fit. The anger, the pride, the way he had tried to bully Miller in front of his children. He couldn't take it back, couldn't undo the damage. Daniels let the silence linger for a moment before continuing. "The mayor's already called for a department-wide review of conduct," he said. "There will be an investigation and you will be the focal point. Don't expect this to blow over, because it's not going to. The city is watching. You're going to be the scapegoat for everything that's been wrong for years, and you know it." Hale's eyes burned with frustration, but he didn't speak. What could he say? There was nothing left. The truth was closing in, and there was no escaping it now. Elsewhere, the morning sun filtered through the windows of the diner, casting long, slanted rays of light onto the polished wooden floors. The air smelled faintly of coffee and frying bacon. Judge Terrence Miller sat at his usual booth with his two sons, Malik and Jordan, across from him. The place was calm, the kind of place where people could relax and forget about the world outside for a moment. The atmosphere was completely different from what it had been just days ago. There was a quiet peace in the air, a sense of normalcy restored, but not without the shadow of what had happened hanging over them. As they ate their pancakes, Malik kept glancing out the window, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of his plate. He couldn't stop thinking about the incident, about how his father had handled the situation with such grace. Jordan was more focused on his food, but there was a tightness in his shoulders that betrayed his unease. He didn't want to talk about what had happened. He just wanted things to go back to the way they were before. "Everything's okay now, boys," Terrence said quietly, his voice calm and steady as always. He smiled at them, trying to reassure them with his presence. But the moment was interrupted when Gerald, the retired lawyer from the other day, entered the diner. His face lit up when he saw Terrence. He made his way over to the booth, nodding respectfully to the judge. "Judge Miller," he said, extending a hand, "I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I've been following the news. What you did, standing up like that, it's inspiring." Terrence shook his hand warmly, grateful for the support but more focused on his sons. "It's not about being inspiring, Gerald. It's about doing what's right." Gerald smiled, but his eyes were serious. "I know, but you've done something bigger than just take a stand. You've set the example for a whole city." Terrence nodded slowly. "It's just the beginning. This isn't about me. This is about making sure this never happens again, to anyone." As they continued their meal, the quiet murmur of the diner around them felt more like an anchor, grounding them in a sense of normality amidst the storm. The battle wasn't over. There would be more fights to come, more obstacles to face. But Terrence had learned something in those few, tense moments when Officer Hale had wronged him. He had learned that true strength wasn't in throwing punches or raising voices. It was in standing firm, in using the truth as a weapon. And now he was ready to continue the fight, not just for his own dignity, but for the dignity of everyone who had been silenced. His sons had witnessed it firsthand, and though they might not fully understand it now, they would one day. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence. A hush hung in the air, punctuated only by the subtle rustling of papers and the occasional shuffling of feet. On one side, Terrence Miller stood tall, dressed in his usual understated but professional attire, black suit, dark tie, and polished shoes. He wasn't wearing his judge's robes today, nor did he need them. He wasn't there as a judge. Today, he was the plaintiff, the man whose dignity had been stripped away in front of his children, whose life had been upended by an officer who had made assumptions based on nothing but race and arrogance. Terrence's face was calm, but his eyes told a different story. They were sharp, focused, and filled with quiet determination. He had lived through this moment countless times in his mind. Every second, every detail of what had happened at the diner, now replayed for the world to hear. The room was full of people, attorneys, journalists, and spectators, but Terrence felt as though he was alone in the center of it all. He glanced at the opposing side, where Officer Hale sat slumped in his chair, looking like a man who had been stripped of his armor. His face was pale, his eyes haunted by the public knowledge of his wrongdoing. The bruises on his career were already visible, but the bruises on his pride were the deepest. Hale's attorney was ready, but nothing could prepare them for the battle that lay ahead. Terrence took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice steady but carrying the weight of years of experience in courtrooms. "On the morning of the incident, I was just a father," he said, his eyes never leaving the jury. "A father trying to enjoy a simple Saturday with my sons. I had no idea that day would become a turning point, both in my life and in the life of this community." He went on to describe the events in meticulous detail. Every word, every movement of the officers, every exchange that had passed between him and Officer Hale. He recounted the officer's words, the ones that still echoed in his ears. "You fit the description." It was a phrase, a pretext used far too often to justify violence and racism. Terrence paused, allowing the room to absorb his words. He then continued, describing how Hale had ignored his identity, how he had been publicly humiliated, handcuffed, and treated as less than human in front of his sons. "I was not just a black man that day," he said. "I was a father, someone who had worked for years to build a life of dignity. And all of that was stripped from me in an instant." He shifted his focus to the deeper issues at play, Officer Hale's history of misconduct. "This wasn't an isolated incident," Terrence said, his voice unwavering. "Hale had a history that was buried by those who should have held him accountable. Complaints were ignored, warnings were dismissed. This wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern of behavior." The prosecutor, a young woman with a sharp but empathetic demeanor, stepped forward to present evidence. Bodycam footage from the day of the incident was shown on a large screen, followed by clips from Malik's viral video. The footage showed the chaotic moments in the parking lot, the officer's rough handling, the fear in his children's eyes, the calm yet firm resistance from Terrence. The room was glued to the screen as the rawness of the moment sank in. The defense team tried to challenge the footage, claiming it was selective and didn't show the full context. They tried to portray the altercation as a misunderstanding. "What we have here, Your Honor," the defense attorney argued, "is a case of confusion and miscommunication." Officer Hale acted in good faith, responding to what he thought was a threat. The courtroom murmured in disbelief. The audacity of the defense only served to highlight the magnitude of the injustice. Terrence looked directly at the defense attorney, unfazed by the attempts to minimize his experience. He didn't need to prove anything. The evidence was right there, undeniable and clear. It was then that the judge, an older man with silver hair and a reputation for being tough but fair, spoke up. "Let's not get sidetracked here," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "This isn't just about what happened to Judge Miller. This is about what could have happened to any father, any day." The room fell silent at the weight of his words. The tension in the air was palpable. Everyone knew that the ruling here would have far-reaching implications. Hale's attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unable to counter the judge's statement. Hale himself sat frozen, his face pale as he absorbed the words that had just been spoken. The truth had hit him square in the chest. This wasn't just about his actions on that day, it was about the bigger picture. It was about accountability, about systemic issues that went beyond this single incident. The courtroom waited for Terrence to continue. When he did, his next words took everyone by surprise. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I want change." His voice was firm but calm, and the room was still. "I want Officer Hale off the force, yes. But I also want him to be enrolled in mandatory racial sensitivity and de-escalation training. I don't want him to hurt someone who doesn't have my title, my position. I want him to learn so that the next person doesn't have to go through what I did." His words hung in the air. The public's perception of this case had shifted in a matter of seconds. It wasn't about punishment. It was about reform, about breaking the cycle of injustice and showing the world that real strength came not from vengeance, but from understanding and growth. The prosecutor, visibly moved, nodded in agreement. "Your Honor, Judge Miller's request is not just a sign of his character. It's a sign of the kind of change we need. We are not here to destroy a man, but to help him become a better one. That's the only way we will move forward as a society." The defense team could not respond. Hale's legal strategy had crumbled, and there was nothing left to defend. The judge leaned forward, looking at Terrence with newfound respect. "You've set the bar high, Judge Miller. I will take your request into account." The room remained silent as the judge called for a recess. Terrence stood up, his heart still heavy but his mind clear. He had come to this courtroom seeking justice, and for the first time in a long while, he felt as though justice was within reach. As he walked out of the courtroom, Terrence's mind raced. The battle was far from over, but the wheels of change had started to turn. He had made his case not just for himself, but for every father who had ever been unjustly targeted. And, for the first time, the world had listened. The court had adjourned, and the day seemed to stretch out in slow motion. Terrence Miller, the federal judge who had become both a symbol of justice and a quiet force for reform, stood before the bench one final time. The gavel struck, and the ruling was made swiftly. Officer Ryan Hale, whose arrogance had once been his armor, now stood in the shadow of his own mistakes. He was terminated with cause, a penalty that was final and irreversible. There would be no return for him to law enforcement without the scrutiny of a federal review, a process that could take years if it happened at all. The courtroom felt thick with anticipation, but it was not the ruling that would reverberate the most. It was the power of what had happened, the change that had followed in its wake. The police department, once so entrenched in its old ways, was now forced to undergo a complete restructuring. A new leadership would emerge, one bound by accountability and transparency. Terrence's quiet victory had rippled outward, its effect both immediate and long-lasting. The old guard had been swept away, and in its place, a system that promised change began to take shape. The ruling was a powerful blow, but it was only the beginning of a larger shift. Terrence knew that the process would take time. Reform never came overnight, but the seed had been planted. As the weeks passed, the media storm surrounding the case began to settle. The frenzy of public interest slowed, but the message had already been sent. People had seen what had happened, and they could not unsee it. They had watched as a man, a judge, a father, had been stripped of his dignity in front of his children. They had seen how he, with unwavering calm and strength, had turned the tide and forced those responsible to face the consequences. The case had ignited a fire of public awareness, but it was not the kind of fire that burned out quickly. It smoldered, it simmered, and it continued to fuel discussions across the country. Terrence's sons, Malik and Jordan, had watched the case unfold with the same quiet intensity that their father had shown. Jordan, once plagued by nightmares, had found peace again. The shadows of fear that had haunted him in the days after the incident had begun to fade. His sleep was no longer interrupted by the harsh images of that day. Instead, he dreamed of his father's strength, of the justice that had been served, and of the future they would build together. Terrence had been his rock in those dark days, showing him the true meaning of resilience and quiet power. Malik, the older of the two, had channeled his emotions into something tangible. The video he had taken on that fateful day, the one that had gone viral and had been seen by millions, became his school project. He titled it "What My Dad Taught Me," and it was more than just an assignment. It was a testament to everything his father had stood for. The project included clips from the video, a written reflection on the lessons of the day, and a powerful essay about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. His classmates, some of whom had once seen him as just another student, now saw him as someone who had witnessed history. Malik was no longer just Terrence's son. He was becoming his own man, with a voice that carried weight. 1 month later, Terrence sat alone in his office, flipping through the stack of papers that had accumulated over the past few weeks. It had been a whirlwind of meetings, press conferences, and legal documents. Yet, amidst it all, one letter caught his eye. It was simple, just a plain envelope, but something about it made him pause. The return address was from a place he didn't recognize, a small town in another state. He opened it carefully, his fingers brushing the paper as he read the words inside. "Thank you. I watched what happened. I didn't know someone like me could be that strong without throwing a punch." The words hit him harder than he had anticipated. He placed the letter down slowly, his eyes tracing the handwriting again. He had known the world was watching, but it was different to hear it from someone on the other side of the country, someone who had been inspired by his actions. It reminded him that the fight for justice wasn't just about him, or even his family. It was about everyone who had ever been wronged, everyone who had ever felt powerless. It was about showing them that they had a voice too. Terrence kept that letter in his office, right next to his federal appointment certificate. It was a reminder that power wasn't about titles or positions. It was about doing what was right, no matter how hard it was. He had shown his sons, and now he was showing the world, that real power came not from raising your voice, but from knowing when not to. It came from standing firm in the face of adversity, from holding the line when the world tried to push you down. The next weekend, after the library and pancakes, Terrence sat with Malik and Jordan in their small living room. The sun was setting outside, casting a warm glow over the room. He looked at his sons, who were seated beside him, their eyes bright and full of questions. "Do you remember what I told you?" he asked them quietly. They nodded, eager to hear the lesson again. "Real power doesn't come from raising your voice," he said, his tone soft but firm. "It comes from knowing when not to." Jordan looked up at him, his eyes thoughtful. "Like when you didn't yell at the officer, right?" Terrence smiled, a deep warmth in his heart. "Exactly. And what happened after that?" Malik, who had been quiet, spoke up. "We changed things. We showed people what was really important." Terrence nodded. "We did. And that's what matters most. We've made a difference. And now we keep making a difference, one truth at a time." Outside, the world moved on. But in their home, time seemed to stand still. They didn't need to speak of it again. The lesson had been learned. And though the world had heard Terrence's message, the real victory was in the quiet moments shared between a father and his sons, moments that would echo in their hearts forever. A month later, Terrence received another letter, this time from a teenager in a different state. "Thank you. I watched what happened. I didn't know someone like me could be that strong without throwing a punch." It was a reminder that his actions had sparked something much larger than any court ruling. It had sparked a movement, a conversation, and a legacy that would continue to unfold in ways he could never have predicted. The road ahead was still long, but for now, Terrence knew that he had done more than just win a legal battle. He had sparked a revolution of the heart, a revolution where justice didn't just come from the courtroom, but from every person who chose to stand up and say, "This isn't right." And as long as that fire continued to burn, there was hope. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional, created to highlight issues of racial profiling and abuse of power. Its purpose is to raise awareness, promote empathy, and encourage meaningful discussions about justice, equality, and accountability in law enforcement.